Hey, how's it going everyone? Welcome back to another video. Now today I'm going to be covering a topic which has been highly requested, which is how to make the jump from using just tutorials and presets and samples for your sounds in your tracks to actually making the sounds from scratch using synths like Serum. Now a concept that I've actually come across recently which I feel is really applicable to this kind of thing is something which is called tutorial hell. And it's basically when you're trying to learn a new skill, often a kind of creative one, you're trying to learn it through tutorials and stuff like that, so you can follow a tutorial perfectly well and get the exact end result that you're aiming for, but then when you sit down and try and make something from scratch yourself, you have no idea where to start. So that's basically what I'm about to help you try and address, is how to make that leap from just using presets and tutorials and stuff like that to actually starting to develop your own kind of sounds which you can use in your tracks. And obviously going down that route helps you to get the exact kind of bass sounds you're looking for in your tracks. So for this video I'm going to be focusing on Serum because I'm a drum and bass producer. Loads of drum and bass producers use Serum. I use it as my main synth. It's a really good synth, but the concepts I'm going to be covering can be applied to basically any synth or any kind of thing that you're trying to learn like this. It's more about the way that you think about sound design rather than the specific techniques, which I will go over some, but like I said, the main thing is about how you start to think whilst you're trying to learn these techniques. Now I should mention before I get into the video that I have a Patreon which you can check out for samples, presets, exclusive tutorials, stuff like that. And I also offer one-to-one lessons which you can check out in the description. So let's hop into FL Studio and we can take a look. So here we are inside of a blank instance of Serum. Now one of the main things that we're going to be talking about is basically you need to kind of familiarize yourself with all of the different elements in here. And if you've been covering a few tutorials, you'll probably be up to speed with how most of the stuff in here works, but that's what you want to go over first. So whether you're using Serum or a different synth, you want to understand how each part works. And in fact, it's not so much like the science behind it, it's more about just knowing if I turn on this section or add this effect, then it's going to tweak the sound in this way. So whenever you're going through tutorials now, that's what you want to start thinking about, is when I adjust a knob, don't just follow what they're doing in the video blindly, and don't just do something just because they do it. You want to listen to the actual way that it's changing the sound. So for instance, if they turn up one dial, is it making the sound more metallic, more gritty? Is it making it sound grottier in a specific way? Stuff like that. And that's where you start to actually learn how Serum works in depth, or whatever synth you're using. And then you can start to apply those kinds of principles to your own sounds. So we've got two oscillators here. If you're not familiar with this, obviously they both make sound. So if I turn that off, there's no sound, and if I turn it on, there is some sound. Now one of the main things I find for getting your sound is you want to start with a decent wavetable. And this is just something where when you go through tutorials, when you go through presets, if you start to take note of the wavetables, which you see a few times, or maybe it's just that you select a certain wavetable and you just think, I love the sound of this. So for instance, some people might load this up and they think, I have no idea what wavetable to pick. And that's where you can just go through trial and error, just listening to them all, and you'll start to find some which you like the sound of. So for instance, if we go into digital, I know because I've practiced quite a bit and had some experience with sound design that this ICANN has kick wavetable can give you some excellent sounds. So if I turn this all the way up, and I know that you want to turn it down 2 octaves, just because that's kind of a standard thing you see again and again with basses. And again, that's the kind of thing that you want to take note of and try and remember these techniques. So there you go, that's what it sounds like 2 octaves down. And obviously I'm sure most people can figure out a bass is a low sound. So if you're turning it down from here to here, if it's not low enough, you know now that you can turn it down on there. And yeah, like I said, this is a wavetable that I just know through trial and error sounds decent right from the off. And that's the kind of thing that you want to go with. And then, so you might have noticed that I turned up the wavetable position here. So these are just a few of the settings that you can tweak and experiment with to see how they modify the sound in certain ways. So the wavetable position, obviously the way you change that is kind of going to be linked to the wavetable. So if we click here on this main bit, you can see this is what the wavetable looks like in the other view. It's kind of like this weird 3D shape. And as you adjust this, it moves through that. So like I said, you don't need to know the exact science of it, but the main thing to know is when you change this, it's not going to change the sound in the exact way between each different wavetable. The way the sound changes is going to be dependent on what wavetable you have. So yeah, that's fairly simple compared to some of the other stuff we can have a look at. So now for instance, this area here called the warp mode is something that can be really good to adjust. And again, this is just where you might go through tutorials, see people using this again and again, see some of these settings being used, and when they tweak it, you might think, I like the sound of this. So for instance here, we could turn on bend plus. And if we start to adjust that, you can make note of how that sounds. And you don't even have to remember it, to be fair, for all of them exactly how it sounds. You can just kind of remember, if I turn on bend plus and turn it up, I think it sounds cool. And that's one of the stages that you can start to do through experimenting when you're trying to make your own sounds. And that's another important thing to emphasize, is most of the time when producers are making sounds, they go through a lot of trial and error. And I know from tutorials and stuff, it might just look like they click their fingers and they've got to the sound they want instantly with like 4 clicks. But in reality, it's never usually that simple, unless you have someone who's an absolute sound design wizard, but that's not most of us. So yeah, it usually takes a lot of trial and error to get to a decent sound. So definitely don't beat yourself up if it takes a while of just messing around. So like I said, this bend plus can be a really cool sound. Then the bend minus as well, depending on the wavetable you've got, but the bend plus works better for this one. Then we also have the bend plus minus as well. And then we've got some other bits. So this PWM1 sometimes sounds cool, sometimes doesn't. But yeah, these bend plus and minus and the bend plus minus ones are kind of the main ones I use, as well as these sync ones. Can sound pretty cool sometimes. You can just mess around with the different ones there. Obviously, like I said, you can go through all of these and make notes and try and remember which ones you like the sound of. And then, of course, something which you probably heard loads about is FM. So if we turn this on, at the moment, it's not going to do anything. So it says from B because the way this adjusts the sound is dependent on what's going on oscillator B. And at the moment, oscillator B is turned off. So nothing's going to happen. But if we turn it on, obviously, you can now hear this, so it sounds slightly different. But if I turn this up, you can hear the sound change. Now, sometimes people will just use oscillator B. In fact, quite a lot of the time, people will just use oscillator B to get the FM. So you could just turn this off, then we're back to the sound that we had before. It sounds no different, but now we can turn this up. And like I said, that's where you want to kind of take a note, remember what that kind of sound sounds like. So that kind of sounded a bit more metallic. So if you start with a wavetable, think, I want to make it sound a bit more metallic, a bit more gritty. That might be where you start to add in some FM. And you can start to just build up a sound like that. And then you might think, I want to make it a bit more screechy. And you might have seen that in a tutorial before, someone had a bit of a screechier sound where they started from something like this and they turn up the octave on oscillator B. And it might sound like you want, it might not, but that's where you kind of go through with trial and error. And then we can start to look at some of the filters. And I mean, these ones are fairly basic inside of the normal bit, but for instance, we can go into the misc bit and we've got some cool ones like the formant filters. And that might be where you hear that sound in a tutorial and you think, I love the way that sounds. It sounds really throaty and vowely. And that can be where you kind of remember, if I want to try and get that sound, that's when I would go and use the formant filter. And like I said, that's where you can kind of have a basic idea in mind. And then you start to learn these techniques over time. And then you can kind of get to the area that you want to get to. And then obviously as well inside of Serum, you can modulate everything pretty much using the LFOs. So if we just make a basic shape here, we just set it to trigger, we can just make something like this. And then we're going to turn the level all the way down. So that's just a very basic sound, but then you can start to add it to stuff like this. And that is, again, one of these things where just through trial and error, you can try adding it to loads of different knobs in here. Some of them will sound quite cool, like for instance, this one can. If, let's say, turn up the rate a bit. Turn up the drive a bit. And then you might try adding it to FM. That sounds rubbish. But yeah, that's where you can just kind of go through trial and error and see what you like the sound of. So I'm just going to turn that off for the time being. And we're just going to remove that. So we can go back to the sound we had before because it was quite cool. And that's where we've got our basic sound. And then obviously as well, there's stuff like the noise and the sub, which you can experiment with turning on. And then inside of here, we've got all of these different effects. And again, this is where you just kind of go through tutorials, go through trial and error, try out different settings in here. And over time, you'll start to learn the bits that you like the sound of. So for instance, a lot of bass sounds are really distorted. So we might add some distortion. and you've just tried out different ones in here through tutorials, messing about. So for instance, I know just through messing about, Diode 2 is one that I like on my bass sounds. And you don't need to understand the exact science behind it or what each name means. It's more about how they sound. So yeah, like I said, I know Diode 2 sounds decent, but for instance, if I try something like Sinefold, I know that I might not like the sound of that as much. And I might like the sound of the Sine Shaper a bit more. I think that's quite a cool sound. We can try turning up the drive a bit. No, I'd probably leave it there. And then for instance, we can go through now. I know phaser, what I like to do with this is turn everything down apart from the frequency, and then we can just mess around with this. And you can get some cool sounds like that. And then for instance, if we go into the compressor, obviously the gain is basically just making it louder, but we can turn on the multiband mode, and that gives it a very certain sound, which again, just through trial and error, loads of different tutorials, messing around with presets, reverse engineering them, you start to get an ear for how these kind of bits sound. So I know that if I turn on the multiband, it's going to basically crispen everything up a lot. And for this sound, it doesn't sound very good, so I'm just going to turn this off because we don't really need it. Then, for instance, at the moment, the sound is mono, so it's right down the middle because there's nothing adding stereo width. Now, I know that there's a couple of things I could use in here just through trial and error and experience. So, for instance, the hyperdimension. Now, that sounds insanely wide and not really what I want. So I could turn the mix down on this bit here because this is one section, the hyper, and then this is another section. So now it's back down the middle, but if I start to turn this up slowly, I could turn the size down a bit. It gives it a bit of stereo width in a way that I like, and I also know that the chorus can do that kind of thing as well. So I'd probably turn the mix down, maybe turn the low pass filter up a bit, and just adjust it like that. And again, just through trial and error, you'll start to learn these techniques over time. Just through, yeah, trial and error, seeing them in tutorials, seeing them in presets, messing around with different knobs in presets and slowly learning what they do. And you can start to build up a workflow of the different bits that you kind of would mess around with when you're going through to make sound. And for instance, so in here we had this filter section, and this bit here, the filter section in here, basically does the same thing. You might notice that all of these are the same as the filters that you've got in this section, and that again, you can just filter the sound twice. So if you had it turned on here, and then if we turn that off so we can hear it, and then we could also modulate this here. I'm going to turn this up a bit, and then mess around with this. And yeah, that doesn't sound that good, but you can mess around with some of the other bits in there. So for instance, we could try adding 2 formant filters. And we could try turning down the mix a bit. Or even modulating the mix with this. And it's just messing around, and you start to get towards a sound that you like. And just through experience, over time, you slowly start to learn what you want to add to a sound to get to a sound that you're more likely to like. And it's the same kind of thing. So obviously we're inside of Serum here, but then you start to learn the effects that you can use inside of the mixer as well. So I've just routed Serum to bass 1, bass high 1, this mixer channel here, and then we can go through and add in some effects that I like to use quite a bit. So for instance, Effector is one that I love to use on either the phaser setting or the Vox setting usually. Probably turn that down a bit. And like I said, over time you just start to mess around with these filters. You can use trial and error to go through the different kinds of filters and effects that you like the sound of, and start to layer them up and get closer and closer towards the kind of end sound that you're aiming to get. So yeah, I'd say the main thing you want to take away from this is when you're approaching tutorials and stuff on how to make specific bass sounds, is don't just passively follow them, where you just click through everything that's going on and you just get to the end bass sound, cool, done. What you want to do is each time that you modify a different element inside of your synth or add on an effect, you want to specifically listen to what that bit of the sound is doing. But yeah, that's everything for today's video. If you found this useful, please leave a like and subscribe for more drum and bass sound design tutorials. I should also mention that if you want to get one-to-one lessons, then after those you can check the link in the description, and I also have a Patreon where you can get loads of extra cool content, samples, presets, exclusive tutorials, exclusive dubs, stuff like that. So yeah, make sure you go and check that out. But yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.